Hey, it's Ezekiel here, and today's walking tour is at Bolsover Castle in Derbyshire. Founded in the late 11th century by William Pervil, one of William the Conqueror's knights, and seized by the crown in 1155. By the mid-14th century, the castle had been neglected. The ruins provided the setting for the little castle as a miniature mansion, which began in 1612 by Charles Cavendish. In 1617, William Cavendish inherited the estate and added other buildings. And in 1660, after the Civil War, William repaired Bolsover Castle. In 1946, the Ministry of Works took over the castle and made repairs. And in 1984, it was transferred to the care of English Heritage. To the left of us was the outer bailey of the original 11th century castle. In 1068, William the Conqueror granted custody of his new castle at Nottingham to one of his knights, William Pervil, together with extensive estates in the area, which included a large manor at Bolsover. The castle was soon built on a ridge high above the Vale. Surviving earthworks and some evidence from excavation show that the early castle took the form of an inner court and bailey at the end of the promontory, corresponding approximately to the fountain garden and great court. The inner court was walled early, the polygon plan resembling that at Nottingham Castle. The pre-conquest manor and church seem to have survived just to the southeast of the castle until engulfed in a large outer bailey, the castle yard. Around the turn of the 11th and 12th centuries, probably at the same time, an enclosed settlement was laid out beyond the castle gate, and the church was moved to its present site within it. Substantial earthworks still define the settlement. William Cavendish was a keen horseman and an expert in the art of menage, which was a form of dressage. The riding house range was devoted to housing, training and maintaining his horses. It was built around 1660, essentially in one operation, from west to east, and consists of 3 sections. On the left, a smithy and a shoeing house with a viewing gallery above. In the middle, a riding house, and on the left a stable with all the lodgings in the garrets. The Crown garrisoned Bolsover Castle, and under successive monarchs it was embellished, repaired and rebuilt, notably after a siege during the First Barons' War in 1216, when a group of barons fought against King John because he refused to accept the terms of the Magna Carta. Wall towers were added or rebuilt during the 13th century, and references in accounts show the castle had a set of kings' and queens' lodgings, probably in and between the towers of the inner court, one of which was the Great Tower. The garrison was finally stood down in 1322, and from then on the buildings gradually fell into decay. For more than 2 centuries, the manor and castle was let to tenants. None of them is known to have lived at Bolsover, but some buildings were perhaps kept habitable for a steward. Menage horses were highly valued, and their status is reflected in the sophisticated architectural detailing of the stable. It had a grand doorcase, flanked by pairs of mullioned windows. Inside there a plaster corniche, still visible at the east end. About 15 horses could be stalled along the back wall, which originally had no windows. The stable was subsequently converted into a pair of two-room apartments, probably under the second Duke of Newcastle in the late 1680s. Windows were cut into the south wall, and fireplaces were constructed in the end walls to heat the principal rooms, and in the corners of the inner rooms. The horses were moved to the former long gallery in the terrace range. All but the east end of this block was unroofed by 1827. The roof was largely rebuilt by the Ministry of Works in the 20th century and covers not only the stable, but also at its west end. This highly ornate oak door once led onto the little castle wall walk. It was designed by William's architect, John Smythson, and shows the attention to detail demanded by William. It is now very weathered, but it may have been once painted a deep earthly red, like the other doors around the castle. George Talbot, later 6th Earl of Shrewsbury, bought the manor of Bolsover from the Crown in 1553. In 1567, he married Elizabeth, Bess of Hardwick, and the following year her daughter Mary married George's second son Gilbert, who inherited as 7th Earl in 1590. Bess's youngest son Charles, from her earlier marriage to Sir William Cavendish, bought a lease of Welbeck Abbey from Gilbert in 1597. Welbeck became his principal house after he purchased a revision of the lease from the Crown in 1600. He took a lease of Bolsover in 1608, acquiring the freehold of the manor and 6 adjacent manors in 1613. There was already a small habitable old house at the castle. This had probably been built or rebuilt during the Talbot ownership and stood on the site of the northern part of the terrace range. In front of us is the viewing gallery, where aging William Cavendish and his guests could view the horses being schooled. Charles Cavendish was a soldier by profession, with a passion for music, the arts and architecture. He was influenced, no doubt, by his mother's extensive and innovative building at her Derbyshire houses, Chatsworth, Hardwick and Oldcoats, as well as building for himself at Welbeck. Charles devised house plans for other members of his circle, using a draftsman to make fair copies. Cultivated with ample funds, Charles was keen to make his mark at Bolsover. Surviving building accounts show that he started to build the little castle over the winter of 1612 to 1613 in anticipation of acquiring the freehold. Work began by making a way into the castle, presumably the origin of the terrace, and setting up a lime kiln on site and masons' lodges at the quarries. The cellars were dug and a section of the great wall of the inner court of the medieval castle was removed. Part of the base of this wall survives beneath the forecourt. The foundations of the little castle was begun on the 30th of March 1613. Drawings by John Smythson for the basement and the hall chimney piece survive, closely resembling what was built, and he was clearly the Mr. Smythson who oversaw the work documented in the 1612 to 1614 accounts. The coat of arms above the door bears his arms as Duke of Newcastle, to which rank he was elevated in March 1665. The little castle followed the characteristic form of a lodge, tall and positioned to take advantage of the views, yet intimate and self-contained. A place for retreat and pleasure. Seen from the forecourt, its expanse of windows and symmetrical facade looked almost conventional for the time, with some resemblances to Hardwick. As the younger son of upwardly mobile parents, but now married to an heiress, Catherine, 8th Baroness, Charles Cavendish was keen to evoke an ancient lineage through the architecture of the little castle. So successful was the design that the myth of the little castle actually being a Norman tower persisted into the 20th century. The kitchens housed in the basement beneath the hall in front of us were designed for maximum efficiency. The scullery led directly into the clerk's office, so that valuable silver plates could be checked in and out. Movement between rooms were carefully controlled, keeping waiters out of the way of the cooks. Multiple ovens cooked a range of dishes, including stews, roasts and fried meats, as well as ornamental banqueting food such as sweetmeats, pies and tarts. When the King and Queen visited William Cavendish at Welbeck and Bolsover in 1634, 41 different kinds of birds were eaten, including 30 peacocks, 30 swans and 20 bitterns. Cavendish was eventually an old man in a hurry, while a thatcher began to cover the wall heads for the winter at the end of the normal building season in October 1613. Work on some of the cellar vaults continued, probably under temporary cover. The wet larder pillar was set just before Christmas, and work continued on the vault into February 1614. Although accounts survive only for the first year and a half, the pace of work is consistent, with the structure of the castle and forecourt being complete by the time Charles died on the 4th of April 1617. By then, the fitting out of the interior was in hand, with the hall chimney-piece dating from 1616. It was left to Charles's eldest son William to finish the little castle. William Cavendish inherited at the age of 25, and in the following year, 1618, married a Staffordshire heiress, Elizabeth Bassett. As a young man, he had travelled to northern Italy with the diplomat Sir Henry Wotton, and been impressed by the etiquette of the court of Savoy. The trip gave him a cultured tour of Europe. His first biographer, his second wife, Margaret, paints a picture of a cultured man with an inherited love of music, poetry and architecture, who was equally fond of swordsmanship and heroic actions, seemingly a great philanderer, but at the same time a loving husband to his two successive wives. He was fond of fashion and magnificence rather than business. The withdrawing room was a place to retire after dinner, and also probably for entertainment. The walls would have had dynastic portraits, emphasising William's noble lineage and the family connection to the restored monarchy. The lodging room contained a state bed, set on the east wall behind a balustrade. Traces of a plaster cornice survive, marking the springing of the loss-covered ceiling. The low door from the lodging room led to a dressing room and stool house, containing a close stool and pan or a chamber pot. These were built as an afterthought, in the gap between this block and the riding house range. Long galleries were typically used for exercise and recreation, but this one was probably envisaged primarily as a place for entertaining large numbers of people. In the early 1630s, there were withdrawing chambers at either end, probably intended to display small works of art. The scars of their walls are visible, together with the arcade inserted across the outer kitchen to carry the northern one. The gallery was originally panelled up to a plaster cornice, below a deep plastered frieze, possibly with decorative painting. When the gallery was re-roofed in the 1660s, the withdrawing chamber was illuminated, the chimney pieces were moved, and a direct connection to the service rooms were made at the north end. The walls were probably then fully panelled, but no details survive. The terrace was originally the drive to the front door of the little castle, which begun in 1612, and later also served as the approach to the terrace range. It was formed by reconfiguring the earthworks of the western side of the medieval castle. After the mid-1660s, once the principal entrance to the terrace range moved to the Great Court, it became primarily a garden terrace with a viewing platform at the north end. From the terrace there is a panoramic view of the Dowley Valley below the limestone scarp, as far as the edge of the Peak District. The medieval park once covered the land down to the stream. In the 17th century, this was a rich agricultural landscape, containing two other contemporary tall houses, Owlcotes, built by William's grandmother, Bess of Hardwick, and now lost, and Sutton Scarsdale Hall, built by Francis Leck. The basement, with its high-level windows, date from the late 1620s. Because it was little altered after 1634, it gives a unique insight into the organisation of service rooms of the time and the scale and sophistication considered necessary to support royal entertainment. The kitchens are not connected to the beer and wine cellars at the north end of this level, reflecting the division in household organisation between the clerk of the kitchen and the butler. Each was served by separate stairs, both from the great court and to the principal floor. There is an inner and outer kitchen, each originally with a roasting hearth and a bank of charcoal stoves for preparing more delicate dishes. The outer kitchen also had stone cupboards, flanking and so to keep warm by the roasting hearth. The arcade was inserted around 1630 to support the change of plan in the rooms and the floor above. On the east side is the pastry, with its bank of ovens. The boiling house originally had one and possibly two metal vats, used for simmering food, set in a masonry with fires beneath. Within the fireplace opening, all these rooms are close to the serving place, where food was assembled and dressed before taking upstairs. Beyond off the corridor are the larders, the wet larder with drain channels in the floor, for raw meat and fish, probably the dairy larder adjacent, for processing milk and storing butter and cheese, with a small fireplace since it could not function if it was too cold, and the dry larder to the dry stores and cook food. Off the inner kitchen was the clerk of the kitchen's room, once vaulted with a small fireplace, and a hatch through to the plate scully, a vaulted room where silver and silk gilt plates could be securely stored and cleaned after use. The adjacent stairs provided service access to the Great Court. William completed the decoration of his father's lodge house by 1621, inspired in part by buildings in or near London, drawn at William's request by John Smythson when they visited the capital over the winter of 1618 to 1619 for Bolsover's furnishings, paintings and carvings. Between 1622 and 1625, Cavendish was busy remodelling his principal house at Welbeck. He built his first riding house and a great stable at Welbeck, both to John Smythson's design before turning his attention to the old house at Bolsover. On the site of the terrace range, his original aim appears to have been to rebuild it with a long 11-bay elevation facing out across the vale, entered at first floor level from the terrace, but otherwise conservative in its design. Only the scale of the kitchens and cellars suggest that it was designed primarily for large-scale entertainment. Bolsover Castle was built within sight of two other Cavendish family houses and had splendid views to the west and north. By building at Bolsover, William's father, Charles, was firmly planting his branch of the Cavendish family. The castle faced towards Bess of Hardwick's houses at Hardwick Hall and Owlcotes, now lost. Sutton Hall, on the other side of the valley, belonged to another nobleman, Sir Francis Leck. The land at the foot of the castle was once part of a medieval deer park. By the 1630s, however, the enclosed park was small, only 95 acres, and William hunted mostly from his home at Welbeck Abbey, which is nearby. Much of William's income came from raw materials, including wood, lead and coal. As coal mining developed at the chief industry of the region, Bolsover town extended from the south to house miners and their families. Most of the houses here today belong to the colliery model village, built in 1894. The little castle he built between 1612 and 1617 is indeed an exquisite miniature house or lodge. Tall and self-contained, it was a place to which the Cavendish family could retire from their formality of life at their main residence at Welbeck. Although entirely new, It resembled a Norman Great Tower, domesticated and modernised over a long time. There are 4 lodges in the forecourt. Their interiors were well appointed, with smiced fireplaces like the garden rooms, suggesting quite high status use, perhaps as lodgings except for the one on the south, which was probably the first bathhouse. Visitors entered the little castle through a porch with a Gothic fan vault, in the middle of a classical symmetrical facade. Above, Hercules holds up the balcony on his back, just as in the classical mythology, in the 11th of his 12th labours, he held up the world for Atlas. The balcony and doorcase above the entrance were installed by Charles Cavendish's son William, who finished the interior of the house by 1621. The little castle is extremely clever in its use of space. There is a clearer, though conscientious, route through the house from being received at the front door to progressing accordingly to one's rank and standing, perhaps even as far as Cavendish's bedchamber on the first floor. The use of this small room is a puzzle. It is very unusual in 17th century England to have a richly decorated heated room next to the entrance to a house. It could have been used for welcoming visitors, but its position to one side of the route to the main stair, combined with its obvious status, suggests that visitors having business with William would have been received and entertained here. By about 1670, this room was called the little room next to the hall, and was furnished with a table and 8 chairs. The closet, a feature common in all corner rooms in the castle, contained a closed stool and pan or chamber pot. The entrance lobby to the hall has a door, high up in the wall, to a vaulted chamber, which was probably the porter's lodgings, reached by a ladder. The hall was used as a dining space for the household and as a reception space for guests. The architecture is a curious hybrid of classical Doric columns and Gothic pointed rib vaults, perhaps to suggest a modernised medieval stone hall. It was originally finished with line false ashlar joints to resemble stone. The layout is similar of that of a medieval hall, with the raised store closet floor suggesting a day on the east and a position of its doors, implying a service passage on the west. The chimney piece dates from 1616, and to the left is a buffet recess, reminiscent of the one in the hall in the terrace range. The hall was planned by Charles and adapted by William, who was responsible for the level floor, inserting the panelling and commissioning the paintings. William Cavendish and his guests used the pillar parlour as a dining room. The elaborate panelling is based on that in the Great Chamber of Theobald's Palace, Hertfordshire, drawn by John Smythson in 1618. The original black and gold paint scheme survives on a panel next to the chimney-piece. The rest is a modern restoration. The paintings depict the five senses and are adapted from engravings by Cornelius Cort after Franz Floris. Starting over the door and going to the right, they show touch, hearing, taste, scent and sight. The opening lines of the 1634 entertainment, Love's Welcomes, suggest that it might have started in this room. William's arms on the chimney-piece show him as Viscount Mansfield, so it dates from no earlier than 1620. The Gothic windows are the work of the vicar John Hamilton Gray, who moved into the little castle in 1829. The Star Chamber was the great chamber of the little castle, a formal reception and dining room, light and airy in contrast to the vaulted spaces below. Its name comes from the gilded lead stars on the sky blue background of the ceiling, which was painted using blue vertier pigment, a byproduct of silver refining. The two window walls are elaborately panelled and decorated with paintings of figures from the Old and New Testaments. The windows all originally had shutters, of which a few survive. When the room was in use, the plain grey painted panelling would have been covered with tapestries or hangings, as it is now, so these walls would actually have appeared richer than the window walls. The tapestries here are reproductions of a mid-17th century set. The room also emphasises William's lineage. The friezes at the top of the wall include the arms of Charles Cavendish and his wife Catherine Oakley, and their son William and his wife Elizabeth Bassett, while the fireplace includes the arms of William's grandmother's last and most noble husband, George Talbot, 6th Earl of Shrewsbury. This was the withdrawing room, unusually not connected to the route to the best bedchamber. While it was part of Charles Cavendish's plan from the outset, the exceptionally rich marble interior, as well as the French doors and balcony, were created for William in the very latest style. Smythson's initial design exists for a room of this type, but with the square plan and including the chimney piece of the Elysium closet. The height required for the vault, however, was only available here. William's bedchamber is reached by a stair from the Star Chamber. Its ceiling is low since it is set over the tall vaulted hall. The bed would have been placed against the south wall of the room. The wall panelling by the window is grained with gold stenciling, which was uncovered in 1999 from beneath layers of later paint. The rest of the room is painted grey, as a background for 3 pieces of tapestries hangings mentioned in the 1670 inventory, which would have been similar to the ones in the Star Chamber. The large number of open cupboards here lined with panelling would have once been obscured by tapestries. There are 4 closets opening from the bedchamber, a stall closet, a dark closet not open to the public, which was perhaps a wardrobe originally without a door, so it would have been closed only by the tapestries. These were the most private spaces of the suite, into which only the most privileged would have been invited. The heaven closet takes the form of a cabinet, with cupboard perhaps intended to display and protect precious artifacts or secure personal papers. The panelling is richly decorated with pastoral scenes in gold. It was cut down to accommodate a ceiling painting of the Ascension, dated 1619. The Elysium closet was perhaps used for intimate social gatherings. It has French doors opening onto the balcony, overlooking the fountain garden. The balcony in its present form is part of William's completion of Charles's building, but the stone palisade was not replaced with an iron railing like the one outside the marble closet until the 1660s. This plain unheated room on the north side was probably the wardrobe where hangings and linen were stored when not in use. This large bedchamber was William's mother's room, and around 1670 it was called the room that gives light to Hardwick. That is to say, it was visible from Hardwick, and Hardwick could be seen from it. The focal point of the top floor is the central lantern, the architectural tour de force of the house, a place to sit and perhaps take dessert. The elaborate fireplaces and panelling testify to the high status of the upper floor rooms. Once the building work had reached first floor level, there was a dramatic change of plan. A large state apartment, backed by a gallery, was interlocked with the south end of the terrace range, and a chapel across the southern end, which was not built. One was created instead on the top floor of the north end of the terrace range, marked on the outside by geometric gables and lantern finals. It was accessed by the wall walk by a doorway dated 1633. This change of plan was probably prompted by William's ambitions at court and facilitated by the Ogley inheritance, followed by his mother's death in 1629. The range had now become something unique in England, a freestanding state apartment and gallery with only a hall, service rooms and a few modest lodgings attached. It seems reasonable to conclude that its primary purpose was to impress and accommodate King Charles I, who had visited Welbeck briefly in 1633 on his way to Scotland and returned the following year to Welbeck and Bolsover with Queen Henrietta Maria. The investment was eventually to pay off. 4 years after the magnificent entertainment of 1634, William achieved his objective of being appointed governor to Charles, Prince of Wales, although he only managed to hold the post until 1641. Charles I and Archbishop Laud wanted to unite the English and Scottish churches and imposed a series of reforms on the Scots. They were violently opposed to what they saw as a threat to their national identity and signed the Scottish National Convent in 1638. Despite lacking support at the home, adequate funds or experienced commanders, Charles tried to impose his authority by force. Early in 1639, William Cavendish lent the king £10,000 and rode north with his Prince of Wales troop of cavalry to join the king's army at Berwick. The campaign ended in a truce. Another campaign in the following year ended in defeat at the Battle of Newburn. In November 1640, William joined the king's Privy Council, and soon after the outbreak of the Civil War in 1642, he was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Northern Royalist counties, elevated to Marquess of Newcastle upon Tyne in November 1643. William was at first successful. After returning briefly to Bolsover in April 1643, where his wife Elizabeth lay dying, he came back in December to set up a garrison under Colonel Muschamp. Traces of his refortification of the Outer Bailey defences were found when the Visitors' Centre was built in 1999. When the little castle was built, the inner ward of the medieval castle became its garden. The surrounding great wall was adapted and refaced to provide an elevated walk called the High Walk in the 17th century, which opens off the great stair of the little castle. The doorway was greatly embellished in around 1633, when a bridge link was first created to the chapel in the newly completed terrace range. The garden's centrepiece, the Venus Fountain, designed by John Smythson, probably marked the completion of this campaign before the royal visit of 1634. In this very rare survival, Venus is depicted drying herself after emerging from her bath. The gardens have been replanted with period plants, using evidence from garden writers of the 17th century. Guests strolling along the wall walk could look out at the statue of Venus emerging from her bath. There were niches and rooms in the garden walls, including a warm, secluded chamber with a decorative fireplace for intimate banquets. Instead of a formal party, there was a fan-trained fruit trees and colourful planting around the walls. Fanciful designs cut into the turf with coloured gravels may have been added for special occasions. In Renaissance philosophy, a circle symbolised perfect love, and in 1634, part of a royal entertainment based on the theme of love was performed here in the garden. The play refers to two cupids, with palm fronds descending from a stage set of clouds and offering the royal visitors a banquet of delicious sweetmeats. On the 14th of August 1644, parliamentarian forces under Major General Crawford began to erect batteries outside the castle. Seeing his position was hopeless, Muschamp surrendered and he and his men were allowed to leave with their horses, small arms and personal possessions. Maintaining Bolsover became a drain on parliamentary resources, and in 1649 the Council of State ordered the slighting of the castle to prevent it being used by royalists. This included demolition of the outwork abroad and garden walls with the turrets and walls of the frontier court that are of strength, and the removal of strong doors and window bars from the house. The design of the little castle drew inspiration from the earlier medieval fortress that stood on this site. There was a castle at Bolsover from the late 11th century, owned by the Pervil family of Castleton in Derbyshire. After the 12th century, the castle was in royal hands. It had a set of royal chambers and a chapel, as well as barns and kitchens. Without any later military use, it was leased out, and by the 16th century, it had fallen into ruins. Vigorous work began on the little castle in 1617, soon after Charles Cavendish bought the site. Labourers, including women and boys, were paid for taking down old walls and bringing stone from nearby quarries. The basement of the little castle was completed quickly, and the structure was finished around 1617. Nothing remains of the medieval castle, although the garden wall follows part of the old Inner Bailey wall. The garden could also be entered through a wide gateway on the west, later blocked adjoining a rib-vaulted garden room, probably fitted with largely glazed doors, which have now been reinstalled. This was most likely used for banqueting and is connected to an inward vaulted room that had Smython-designed fireplaces for cooler days. Both rooms were created within a thickening of the wall. Across the gardens are seats, alternating with niches, which would have been used for beehives or possible lanterns. In contrast, the two small rooms on the opposite side of the garden are ultrarium vaulted chambers with large plain fireplaces. One was probably the still house, used for distilling medicines and spirits. The other room could have been the chamber in which William and his chaplain, Dr. Robert Payne, conducted chemical experiments. The little castle remained intact through the Civil War, although it had been stripped of its contents. Charles Cavendish, William's elder son, spent £15 14 shillings on glazing in 1656, and at some point the gateway to the forecourt was rebuilt. On Charles's death in 1659, William's second son Henry took over and began to plan work. The rebuilding of the State Apartment in the mid-1660s suggests that its walls had also suffered major damage. It was probably not considered part of the private habitation, but it was an obvious political target. William Cavendish died in 1676, and Bolsover passed to his son Henry, who used it occasionally. Henry was an active Tory politician, loyal to Charles II and James II, but refusing the oath of allegiance to William and Mary. He was a man of unsteady, fickle humour, who fell out both with his father and his wife. As in the terrace range, there was originally no connection between the kitchens and cellars at basement level, which is why there are 3 internal and 2 external sets of stairs. At the bottom of the back stairs is the servery, where food drawn through hatches from the kitchen and pastry were assembled. It was also where supplies were brought in from the forecourt, with access to 2 levels of larder under the porch as well as to the dark fuel store. The wet larder, with its stone salting vats, seemed to have been used as a scullery. Duke Henry died in 1691, heavily in debt. He left his entire estate to his favourite daughter, Margaret, wife of John Holles, 4th Earl of Clare, made 1st Duke of Newcastle upon Tyne, of the second creation in 1694. John died in 1711, and on the death of his widow in 1716, Bolsover passed to their daughter Henrietta. By this time, the furnishings of the little castle were described as old, while those of the terrace range lodgings were variously referred to as very old, moth-eaten or rotten. Henrietta married Edward, Lord Harley, who became 2nd Earl of Oxford in 1724. She repaired the buildings, completely renewing the roof of the little castle between 1750 and 1751. The pastry had a bank of 3 ovens, opening from a single firing point, a design copied in the terrace range. It also had its own warm, dry store alongside. When Henrietta died in 1755, Bolsover passed once again through the female line to her daughter Margaret, wife of the 2nd Duke of Portland. It stayed in the ownership of successive Dukes of Portland until the mid-20th century. The little castle remained habitable, but the terrace range was unroofed by 1770. The 3rd Duke of Portland used Bolsover as a stud farm. Around this time, the crenellated parapets on the terraced and garden walls began to be lost. Internal walls began to be removed from the terrace range in the 1770s, but before much damage was done, the 3rd Duke decided to keep it as a roofless ruin. It began to appear in guidebooks to Derbyshire and the Peak, and was saved by growing interest of antiquaries and tourists in pursuit of picturesque and romantic places. Bolsover was more than a little village until the opening of Bolsover Colliery in 1889 and the building of the Garden Village in 1893. Its population peaked in the early 20th century, and increasingly the castle provided recreation for this industrial community. By 1903, the riding house was used as a drill room and had been fitted out by the present Duke of Portland as a gymnasium for the Boys' Brigade. During the First World War, the gallery was used as a rifle range, and by 1918, the castle yard housed a bowling green and a tennis court. Let's take to the sky with Jack Roberts. Thank you all for watching. If you've enjoyed our videos, please leave us a comment, stick a thumbs up and maybe think about subscribing to the channel for the next video. Do take care and have a fantastic week ahead.